The temptation is to give a very polished sermon that glosses over the meaning of these basic and difficult texts. Instead, I'm going to offer a very, very rough Bible study, which I hope will allow Jesus and his challenge to shine through. First, the gospel. Turn the other cheek and love your enemy. This is obviously very basic Jesus, as Luke only uses these two verses and these two passages and the one about do not judge your neighbor when he writes this sermon. From the beginning of Genesis, from the beginning of human history, violence has been our fundamental problem. One step up has been justice. Only an eye for an eye, only a tooth for a tooth. Equal violence to confront violence. Jesus took the next step, teaching us not to fight violence with violence. Instead, he proclaimed that we should return good for evil. And from the beginning, humans have said, but, Jesus, and use their buts to ignore what he's saying. First, with this one, they said, but Jesus, what if someone strikes you on the right cheek? So I asked David to come up here and we'll show you what that is. We've got to remember that the Bible is written very carefully, and he was very careful. Son-in-law. But did you notice? Strikes you on the right cheek. Do it again, David, so you see. That's not a blow to inflict injury. That's a blow to insult. That's what's used when a Roman wants to humiliate a Jew. When a soldier wants to degrade a civilian. That's what's used when a master wants to scold a slave. Or a parent wants to get a child into line. And in that society and in ours, that's what a husband does when he wants to put his wife in her place. So Jesus says, if someone does that to you, I'm telling you, turn the other cheek. Now look what you do when you turn the other cheek. In other words, he's saying, you don't have to take it. You don't allow a person to put you down. You keep your dignity. If he's going to insult you, say, go ahead. Prove that you're unequal. Now, at first that might seem a little silly, but stop and think. I'll tell you what I think about. I think about the time my father spanked me. The only time in his life he spanked me. He was a great guy. And I remember as he spanked me, I kept thinking to myself, he's not going to make me do what I don't want to do. And he continued. And then he got what was happening, and he's, being a wise man, stopped, and he never tried it again. Of course, I learned then how to be a parent. I spanked two of my kids, each time once. The second one, who was your pastor's wife, I spanked, and she said, go on, old man, hit me harder. Hit me harder, old man. And that's when I finally learned. Violence doesn't teach anything. And that's what Jesus was saying. Now, of course, most of us, or 95% of us now are saying, oh yeah, Jesus, great idea. Turn your head, and there's a lot of people in the world who will clobber you. Unless we all think we're clever about that, let's remember that the stupidest person in the world knows that, and so did Jesus. But what he was saying was, we're not going to return violence for violence, but we're not going to be passive either. And it might be that sometimes we can change things. There is a better way. And too often we forget that better way really does work. We forget the women's movement. Sure, there was some little bit of bloodshed, but for the most part, it worked. The civil rights, kicking the English out of India, bringing down the Berlin Wall and releasing all the states which had been under the dominance, imperialism of the Soviet Union. The overcoming of apartheid in South Africa and Namibia. All the times in your family when it's worked. Christianity overcoming the Roman Empire with social institutions and more tender laws. Jesus is not telling us to give up protecting our families. He's not telling us to allow abusers to have their way. But he says there is a third way, and we should be using it. There's not any one way to handle everything. And what becomes awful in society is when that is preached as Christianity. There's only one way to handle violence, and that is to come back with violence. Second but Jesus. You know these guys, they're forcing us into debt. And then they're taking us to court and suing us for our coats, even our coats, so that eventually we're going to have to sell them our land. You know what these foreign guys are doing to us. And Jesus said, okay, at least one of the commentators I recently read said he had a little humor here, that because he said if you think of first century clothing, basically it would have, he said give them your shirt as well as your coat. And he said in first century that would mean, translate into our language, if they sue you for your pants, give them your underpants as well. In other words, stand there and let them see what they're up to. Let them know that you know what they're up to, and they can't use the law to take away your dignity. Oh, but Jesus, they said, well, I'm working hard, I'm trying to feed my family. Along comes this blasted Roman soldier, and he says, carry my baggage a mile. What do we do with that? And Jesus says, well, here's something you could do. At the end of the mile, say, well, sir, I'll carry it a second mile for you. You have to remember, or you have to realize that there was military law which said a soldier could ask you to carry it 1 mile, but it was against military law, and you'd be punished if you forced him to carry 2. So essentially what you're saying is, you're not controlling me. Let me throw it back in your face. I'll carry the second mile for you. Challenge. The second big human problem has always been how to handle our money. So Jesus ends up here, after a little humor, by saying, give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. Oh, but Jesus, You know there's all these poor people around. If I start doing that, I won't have any money left to feed my family. And of course, Jesus says, oh, come on. Come on, you know what I mean. Nobody here is going to give all their money away so they can't feed their children. You know I don't mean that. I'm telling you, be generous. Have a type of heart that's open and is generous. So do you even love your enemies? Because as was going on, the music and everything before us, they're children of God just as you're children of God. We're all made in God's image, and we should treat everyone with love, even to make enemies friends. Old Testament. Actually, I was studying a few verses before this, which I think David eliminated to help you out here a little bit. But that starts out, well, what Jesus ends up saying then is, be perfect as God is perfect. And Luke says, he defines it a little bit. He said, that means be merciful as God is merciful. And today we would use the word generous. I mean, nobody uses mercy anymore, right? We don't even know what the dickens it means. But be generous as God is generous. And what happens in the Old Testament lesson here in Leviticus, old state Leviticus, is it starts out, be holy as God is holy. And then he uses a thing in the temple, which we often don't think of. He said, if you leave your sacrifice, when you make a sacrifice of thanksgiving for what God has given you, first fruits, in the temple, eat the sacrifice in the same day. What we got to remember is that what happened in sacrifices wasn't that the temple took everything. The temple would take a piece of meat, maybe burn it, and then the priest would keep some of it, and the rest would be given back to you. Well, if it's given back to you and you're a rich person which is able to make a big sacrifice like a lamb, you have a problem. Especially if God says, eat the sacrifice the same day. Or at least, it says, within 3 days. Because the only way you could, he said, otherwise it would be an abomination to the Lord. The only way you can do that is to share it. Is to share it with other people. The next one then is what we have here, the gleaning, which we all know, right? He says, well, when you harvest your fields, be sloppy. Leave some for the poor. If you translate that into modern language, it would be, don't just work for your own profit. If you're going to be godly, then pay your people a decent wage and even build into your business provision for the poor. I forgot to say what the modern thing would be with the sacrifice, but I think you can figure it out. Basically, it would be, if you're at your evening meal, like my wife and I are every evening, and thank God for your plenty, but you are not sharing your plenty with the poor, then your prayer is an abomination, profanity in God's ears. The third one was, in the Old Testament, was do not keep a laborer's wages until morning. Remember, they were day laborers. You were supposed to pay them in the evening so that they could then go and buy food and feed their family. If you kept the money on the until the next day, you had the use of the money and not they. And translate in our language, it would be, if you're a big company, don't hold that interest back a day so you make the interest, you make interest on the money, but send it out to people who need it. Or don't charge ludicrous interest on credit card debt so you run people into the ground and then they become poor, or all the other financial tricks which are foisted off on us day after day. That's ungodly. Then Jesus ends up this one, if you notice, he slides you into it. He says, do not trip a blind man. Do not speak evilly in front of a deaf man about him. Sure. Don't profit from the blood of your neighbor. He's getting close now. Don't profit from the blood of your neighbor. And don't give special favors to rich people or poor people. We're all made in the image of God. Act like you're made in the image of God and treat other people that way. I think you see what I was trying to do. I was trying to distance myself from these things so that you can argue with me. In a sense, I'm saying, this is what Moses and Jesus say. Argue with them if you don't like it. And I was coming down this morning, I thought of, it's been a very, very hard time for me because I lost one of my best friends recently. And we had his memorial service yesterday. And of all things, he was a great guy. He was a Harvard lawyer, brilliant Harvard lawyer, academic officer. And he left a letter to be read at his funeral. I thought, oh boy, this will be good, because he also was a master at telling dirty jokes. And I thought, this is going to be good. But this is what he said. He said, I'm happy. I've been happy for the first time in my life in the last several years. And he said, I became happy when I realized life isn't only about having a rational mind, but it also is taking care of your emotions. And he said, when I realized that, I became happy. And I happen to know one of the incidents which led him to that, and that was after his second divorce. As he was shooting off to his therapist said, whoa. He said, Bob, he said, did it ever occur to you that it's all right to lose an argument? And when he realized that, it changed his life forever. Many of us spend our whole lives arguing with Moses and arguing with Jesus. And so, in memory of my dear friend, Bob, let me remind you, it's all right to lose an argument with Jesus.